In the late 80s, in New York, there was a radio commentator whose name was Barry Farber. He was a Southerner. Member from the MCA, may she rest in peace. Barry Farber. He was an interesting man. You listen to him talk. I always thought of him as a short little guy. He was 6'6". He was a big man. And he had his unique Southern touch that he brought. Talk radio wasn't yet what talk radio is today. AM radio was still music once upon a time, remember?
Yes.
MCA was a tiny little radio station. They couldn't afford music, so they had people talking. But of course, there was an evolution. Things changed. And at the end of his career was the 80s. Remember once listening to him, he was on a different station, OR, he said, "The Iron Curtain has turned to Vonischen Blind." That was his line. The Iron Curtain has turned to Vonischen Blind. So, in the late 1980s, the Iron Curtain was turning to Vonischen Blind. And one of the things that was going on at the time, by the way, if you really stop to think about it, people say that the miracles of the Bible sound unbelievable. The miracles of the Bible, they're just impossible. It couldn't have happened. We, all of us who are, over, I don't know how old you got to be, 35, yeah? We're witnesses to one of the greatest miracles in history. And it was such an incredible miracle, we didn't even see it as a miracle. If you had negotiated in 1963 the end of the Soviet Union, the collapse of the Soviet Union, and 10 million people, 20 million people, World War II was 60 million deaths. If you would negotiate, the Soviet Union would go away and so many millions of people, you would sign on the dotted line, no questions asked. The Soviet Union went away like Vonischen Blind. We witnessed one of the most incredible acts of God in the history of mankind, in front of our own eyes. Seriously, if you don't, some people call God Ronald Reagan, you know what I'm saying? But I still call God God. Ronald Reagan was very important. A lot of other people were very important. But the fact of the matter is, you want proof, miracles of the Bible, that we, all of us, were witness to a miracle of biblical proportion, in my opinion. You disagree? What can I tell you? You're too smart and too sophisticated. I'm simple and stupid. But I think we don't appreciate the enormity of it because it was so enormous. If people had died, if there was a revolution and people were killing, and we'd all say, wow, what a wonderful thing. But it happened almost like it was a natural evolution. In other words, the event was so miraculous that it just blinded us, it dazzled us. So during that period, 87, 88, 89, so they had these radio shows. I remember listening to the radio, must have been 91 or 92, they had George Bush, Boris Yeltsin, and Mikhail Gorbachev on the radio at the same time. I don't have a television, so this is the radio. And they had international broadcasts. People called from Russia. I remember listening to that broadcast, and somebody called up and asked, "Do you believe in God?" And Bush said, "Yes." And I forgot what Yeltsin said, but Gorbachev said, "I am an atheist. I am an atheist." And then he spent 5 minutes explaining how much he respects religious people. But I don't know if he would still say that today, but at that time, "Ya at the yat." I remember those words. I'm an atheist. Anyway, so during that time, there was a few years that on ABC radio, which is, you get it in New Jersey, I'm sure, they had Phil Donahue. I practiced these names before the Farbrengen because otherwise I forget it. And a fellow named Vladimir Posner. I've since heard interviews of his where he claims that everything he said then he didn't really believe, he had to say it, but he sounded so convincing. Vladimir Posner is an American-born Jew. An American-born Jew whose family went back to the Stalin utopia. He was a communist, and he was a believer, and he grew up in Moscow, And he was Radio Moscow for decades. He was Radio Moscow. In other words, the Russian propaganda to the West was a Brooklyn Jew. A Jew from Brooklyn named Posner. My great-grandmother's maiden name was Posner, so we're cousins. The Alter Rebbe's father, Alter Rebbe had a great-grandfather whose family name was Posner. The Alter Rebbe took the name Borochovich. He had a brother whose name was Posner. Half Lubavitch are descendants of the Alter Rebbe's brother Posner, as am I. And Vladimir Posner, I don't know if he's related, but I'd like to think he was, because that's how Jews are. But Posner and Dani was also Jewish, very, very secular, and they had these radio shows, and I listened. Not Jewish? Okay, they just made him into a guy. In Brooklyn, they say, in the mikveh, they say he's Jewish. He became a guy. Okay, he's not Jewish. Fine, I have no problem. But Posner certainly sounds very Jewish. And I'll never forget this. I was a big boy. I was in my early 20s. And I don't know how the topic came up. But the question was, what is the meaning of the word Jew? It's a terrible topic. That's terribly politically incorrect. But that was the time. You're not allowed to talk about that. That's like really a bad thing to discuss. And this was a national broadcast. It wasn't in New York. All over America. And I don't know what Daniel had to say. If Daniel was not Jewish, then he probably didn't have much to say, or he didn't say much. But Posner went on and on and on. He pontificated, and I literally was screaming at my radio. It was the one occasion that I talked to the radio and expected the radio to talk back. He said, "What's a Jew? It's not a race. There are black Jews, there are white Jews, there are red Jews, there are all kinds of Jews. It's not a religion. I'm an atheist, and I'm a Jew. It's not a culture. You have Sephardic Jews, you have Ashkenazic Jews, you have Jews of age." And he went through every possible stereotype, every possible categorization box you could put the word Jew in. A religion, a race, a culture, a society. He went through, he's smarter than me. And he went through like 6 or 7 different things. And he says, so what is a Jew? And it was a rhetoric. He did not answer the question. I remember screaming at the radio. I was a Lubavitch, at the age of my life that I still screamed at people, and I thought that worked. Yeah, I still scream at people, but I know it doesn't work. In those days I thought, scream loud enough, they'll take if I really, really scream, then I really must be right. Not that I really mean it, but I'm right, you see. If you scream so loud, then you mean it. If you scream even louder, then it's got to be true. And I screamed at the radio. I said, Pintalayid, don't you understand, Mr. Posner? He could not. You couldn't give a better class in Chassidus philosophy than Mr. Posner was giving on the radio to the whole America. Because he said it doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense. What's a Jew? What's a Jew? You ever meet a Reform Muslim? A non-denominational Muslim, a disenchanted Christian? There's no such thing. If you're not practicing Muslim, you're not a Muslim. If you are an atheist, you're not a Christian atheist or an atheist, you're a non-Christian. How many Jews are atheists? And don't you dare say they're not Jewish, because they'll kill you with all the religious fervor of their Jewishness or atheism, I don't know which, but they're both religious. So the deal is, so I remember screaming at the radio, and Mr. Posner ignored me. He was really, really rude. I was talking to him, and he just kept on talking. The problem was I was interrupting him, but it was also rude. Because he brought out the point that the Baal Shem Tov wanted to bring out, so crystal clear. You cannot, I'll tell you something. I had a student who studied in Stephen S. Wise in California to be a Reform rabbi. And she told me that they spent an enormous amount of time. One of the most important parts of the indoctrination to be a Reform rabbi was the question of Jewish martyrdom. Jews are not Muslims. We die for other reasons. Yeah. We don't die for hate. But historically there have been many Jews who've given their life to be Jewish. When I started teaching, I teach Tanya. Tanya is the classic work of the Alter Rebbe, of Chassidus. And there's a section of Tanya that talks about martyrdom. I was teaching it to teenagers, 15-year-old kids. I'll never forget the scene. I had a kid in my class who already then, he was a 15-year-old boy, but he was probably not religious already. He was a very rebellious boy. It was a big room. It was a very, very large classroom, and it was a very small group of students. And shall we say he didn't show up very often, and shall we say I didn't mind that he didn't make an appearance. But that particular evening he was there. And we read that piece on martyrdom. I'll never forget him. He got up. This was a troublemaker. A troublemaker. He started running around. It was a big classroom. There were maybe 8 students in a very small class, but a very big room. He said, "Are you nuts? If someone gives me a cross and a sword, I kiss the cross in a minute. I'm going to die not to kiss the cross. Are you crazy?" And he was like so disturbed by the idea that a Jew would die not to give up his faith. It bothered him. It bothered him religiously, you understand? It touched the nerve. This was 1990, I think it was 93, if I go correctly. A little while before, I don't know how many, maybe 89 or 90, there was an event that occurred in one of the Muslim countries in the Far East. Maybe it was Malaysia. But I don't remember. 5 Israeli soldiers had finished their tenure in the Israeli army. And of course, after you finish your tenure, you go east. Now there's Chabad houses to ruin your trip wherever you stop. But in those days, you could have a lot of fun without the Chabad ruining you. There are Jews who would never ever talk to a Chabadnik in Israel. But in Bangkok, best friends. Jews are interesting, and they really are interesting people. So these 5 kids, I think it was Malaysia, and they were arrested as spies. And when they looked through their papers, and they were foolish enough to carry their identity as Tzahal, Tzva Haganah Yisrael, the Israeli Defense Forces, so it was confirmed. And they were put in jail. I remember reading the article. The essence of it was these were not 5 guys from, from the Shiva Bacham. These were tough kids. Twice they escaped. Twice they fought off their oppressors and escaped. But it was they fought. They didn't all make it. Some of them were killed. But they fought. They broke themselves out of their imprisonment once and a second time. At a certain point, there was an Israeli boy who was modern, who was frum, who was Orthodox, but he probably couldn't have been too Orthodox if he was going to the Far East after he finished with the army. But he kept Shabbos kosher, tefillin, I don't know what else. Except if the food was too good, he was kosher, yeah? And he was with these kids, most of them were Shomer, they're very secular boys. And he survived. And he related an interesting thing. He had a friend who was a sworn atheist. He worked with this kid, they were friends, they were buddies, There's no such thing as a friend like a friend you make in the army. It's a fact of life. Especially if you actually see combat. And this kid was an atheist. And they argued for 3 years, they fought with each other. You're an idiot, you're smart and sophisticated, you're stupid and simple, however the arguments went. But he could not get anywhere with this atheist friend of his. He was trying to sort of make him consider maybe there's a God. Forget it, out of the question. So these kids they were captured together, and at a certain point they were given a choice. That if they were converted to Islam, they wouldn't kill him. And this atheist, who for 3 years argued with his religious friend, says in an instant, shoot us, without hesitating. We're not going to give up our religion. There was no religion. There was no religion. And I had just read an article about this. I think it happened in 89. I had this conversation with my students, so it was 93. So I just read an article on it, and this kid is running around my classroom, but at least he was arguing with me instead of burning the house down. This is ridiculous. He couldn't wrap his mind around the idea. A Jew should die to be Jewish. That's so stupid. That's so idiotic. So I told him the story. That here was a Jew who dedicated his life to the denial of God until someone told him that he should deny God or he'll kill him. He says, no, I will not deny God. That's how much of an atheist a Jew can be. I told him the story. I forgot his reaction, but I got quiet in the classroom for a few minutes. For a few minutes he behaved. The point I want to say was this. I had this student, I don't know how many years she spent, but she wanted to become a Reformed rabbi, Stephen Iswise. And she said to me that in this academy, there was a lot of effort put in to rationalize the aspect of Jewishness that's irrational. Why would a Jew die for being Jewish? Why? That's so stupid. It's such a waste. It's so useless. It doesn't make sense. It really doesn't make sense. It's stupid and simple. And that really is stupid and really simple. And she said it was very, very important to find a psychological explanation. That when you live in a group and everybody behaves a certain way, so you conform, you sacrifice your independence, you stop thinking for yourself, this kind of thing. When she started to learn Chassidus, she discovered that Chassidus teaches that there is something fundamentally irrational about being Jewish. This is what the Baal Shem Tov prioritized. He didn't invent it, you understand? The Baal Shem Tov did not invent the Jewish soul. The Baal Shem Tov did not invent the idea of faith. Faith means something which is higher than reason. I have a relationship with God that does not pass through my mind. I have a relationship with God which certainly passes through my discriminating mind, but there is a part of my relationship with God which is from my soul to the soul of God, if God has a soul, without passing through my mind. Is the whole of Chassidus, I think. Meir Kahane wrote a book, Why Be Jewish? Why be Jewish? Why be Jewish? It's a really interesting question. It's an interesting question, and we're not the first one to ask it. This question has been asked throughout history, in various times, in various ways. Sometimes it was asked because Jews were suffering so much. Melt, disappear, just don't be noticed. How many stories do you hear today of parents who survived the Holocaust and raised their children without any Jewish identity? In some cases, with a Christian identity. And not because they hated Judaism, because they just didn't want to die. It was as simple as that. And at some point, their children or grandchildren would discover by mistake that they were Jewish and forget about it. The whole world turned upside down. It happens constantly. It happens today. I heard a story recently, I don't remember the details, but that's the spirit of the story. Sometimes Jews want to melt away because they suffer so much. And sometimes Jews want to melt away because they have so much opportunity. Why do I have to be Jewish? It's only a liability. Here's a civilization that's colorblind, that's multicultural, that's so accepting. Why do I have to carry around the scarlet letter? Why do I need it for? Why do I need? Why? Exactly what motivates me to identify myself as a Jew? I was a boy. I was 18 years old, 17 years old. The Lubavitcher boys, my children are before Bar Mitzvah, and they do this. Well, not before Bar Mitzvah, I was following the Yankees, so I wasn't doing this. But my kids don't follow the Yankees. Friday afternoon, when the school is out, the kids go to the city, they go to Manhattan, and they have routes. They visit Jews every Friday and put film on with them. And there's such a huge competition. There's a lot of Bacharim, there's a lot of boys in Crown Heights. And there's a lot of Jews in Manhattan, but apparently they all find the same ones. So you got to get there before everyone gets the film. So we used to go on Mitzvah. I was living in California at the time, and I went with another boy, and we call it Mitzvah. You go out into the street, you find Jews, you put film on them. And to put film on people in the middle of the street, you got to be a special level of Lubavitch. I wasn't special level Lubavitch, I was a plain Lubavitcher. So we had a route. You would go into business offices, you met the same people every Friday, you made their acquaintance, and if they were nice enough and they were in the mood, they put on film, you would talk to people, you had that literature which had a thought for the Parsha and so forth. I went on Mivtzoyim, I went on Friday afternoon with a boy who was a real Lubavitcher, really. I mean, I was a lot of times embarrassed for things he did, and now I'm embarrassed to say that I was embarrassed. He had this very strange custom, but I was a witness to this. I saw this happen 100 times. We went on Miftzayim in Wilshire Boulevard in Beverly Hills. All of the offices we visited were representatives for Las Vegas hotels. In other words, it was up, I don't want to call it sophisticated, but it certainly was not schnutters. It wasn't schleppers. Understand? I don't consider gambling in a hotel in Las Vegas sophisticated, but maybe that makes me a bad person. But it certainly was upper crust. These were rich people. And when you went from building to building, you would walk on Wilshire Boulevard. Now in California, nobody walks the street. God forbid, that's a biblical commandment. Thou shalt not walk the streets of California. You go from the car and someone carries you to the house. But on occasion, there would be a human being on the street. And my friend would stop anybody on the street, "Are you Jewish?" Which is such a rude thing to say, you know? I always think about Israelis. My Lubavitch Israeli brethren go Miftzayim in Israel. But they don't have to ask that first question. "Are you Jewish?" is so insulting. In New York, you don't have to ask, "Are you Jewish?" You can just say, "Would you like to put on film?" And if you get an Italian, so maybe you put on film with an Italian, you know. If you're in California, it's the hardest question. In Israel, you don't have to ask that question because they're Jewish. So now you want to put on film. You know, Israel spoke to one, "I love you," smash the guy in the face, you put on film, you smash him again, and everybody's happy. So he would ask people, "Are you Jewish?" And we were 17 years old, a few hairs on the chinny chin chin, and we were not exactly sophisticated. Maybe we were smart, but we were not sophisticated. Certainly we're not cultured. And it was invasive, it was rude. And these business people would tell us no, and the no was, "Get out of here, you little schnook." And he would say, "You're not Jewish." He would ask a person, "Are you a Jew?" And they would say no. We got some of, "Unfortunately not," and "Thank God not," and "I wish I was." It's very interesting. Gentiles react to that question in very interesting ways. But the Jews, forget about it. And he would repeat, "You're not Jewish." And the person would stop and say, "I am a Jew and leave me alone." This happened again and again and again. I want to ask you a stupid question. You stop a person on the street with tefillin. You're a rude Brooklynite who's invaded Beverly Hills. You're a troublemaker. You stop a person on the street, and I was so uncomfortable. I was very happy going into the offices. But stopping people on the street, you really have to believe it. It's not simple. It's not easy to do. I was going on Miftzayim. I didn't know what solicitation means. No soliciting. I was a solicitor. I didn't know what the word meant, so I couldn't accuse me of a crime. So listen to this. He stops a person on the street. "Are you Jewish?" "No, I'm not." And all he did was say, "You're not Jewish." I must have seen this happen 20 times. It was the most remarkable thing. "I am a Jew, now get out of my sight." Now explain this to me. A young upstart approaches a man 3 times his age, who's established, who's sophisticated, who's intelligent, not an idiot, and asks him a question which is really very rude. And the person says no. Why? No means "don't bother me," which is, I guess it's polite. I don't want to get into arguments with you. If I tell you yes, you're going to ask me another question. And I'm going to have to tell you no. And then you're going to ask me a third question. So let's just save all the no's. I'll crunch it to one no. I'm not Jewish. I'm an Italian. Go bother him. I'm Irish. And then he says, "You're not a Jew. Can you please tell me why a successful man in his 40s, 50s, and 60s would take offense to somebody repeating what they just said?" If you can explain that socially or rationally, I will admit that the Baal Shem Tov was a hoax. If you cannot explain that reasonably or rationally, then you understand Chassidus. You understand Lubavitch. You understand the Lubavitcher Rebbe. You understand faith. You understand the meaning of the word Jew. Jews are a family. We fight like cats and dogs until somebody else starts up with us. Like all families. But there's something about what binds us, whether we're European or we're Sfadim, or Reform, or Orthodox, or affiliated, unaffiliated. There's something about it that's not rational, and the Baal Shem Tov said, I want to squeeze that nerve. I want to find that point, I want to press it and press it and press it and press it, until the Jew says, I'm so uncomfortable, what should I do? And you tell him, put on tefillin. The Baal Shem Tov lived a long, long, long time ago, when Jews lived in shtetls and couldn't read and write. For a person who can't read and write to believe in God is not complicated. He doesn't believe in anything. He can believe in the tooth fairy. He can believe in Santa Claus. Because he's a simple person. But we don't live in shtetls. We're not simple people. The worst amongst us is better educated than the shtetl people to whom the Baal Shem Tov spoke. The least educated amongst us is far more discriminating, critical in our thinking. You tell me something, believe in the tooth fairy. Okay, explain to me why. That's all. I'm not saying there's no tooth fairy. Just explain to me why. I want to understand. The Baal Shem Tov spoke to us in America in the 21st century. And he said, I'm not explaining it. I'm not. I didn't explain it to the simple Jew in the shtetl, and I'm not explaining it to you. And I have a choice. To say that Baal Shem Tov was a fool and a simpleton, you may say so. Or to listen to what the man has to say and say, this isn't rational, but it's factual. It's a fact of life. It's a fact. We're sitting at this table. There should not be Jews. And there are proud Jews who want a relationship with God, who want to relate, it's an interesting thing, who want a relationship with God. God used to be simple. Then God became a dirty word. And then God became an enigma. God? I don't know. Maybe not. But there's a part of us, there's a part in every human being, I believe, but particularly in the Jewish people, that has a relationship with God that's not enigmatic, that has a relationship with God Almighty which is not agnostic, it's not complicated, it's not I'm thinking about it, it's not I'm too smart to say there isn't a God, but I'm also too smart to believe in Him. And the Chassidus is interested in identifying that point in each of us and making that the basis for our Jewish life and ultimately for our religious life. What does it mean to be a Jew? I have a Jewish soul. A Yiddish neshama. If you'll think about it, you'll understand a lot of things. First of all, you explain why many people call Hasidim crazy, because they are. Second of all, you'll certainly understand why the Baal Shem Tov is so controversial. Ask the average person, what's Chassidus? They still don't know. What's the Hasidic movement? Can you write an essay on the Hasidic movement? Can you write a report that can summarize what Chassidus is? You can't put it on paper, because if you're putting it on paper, you're trying to explain it. And you're trying to explain the inexplicable, trying to rationalize an idea that's predicated on there's an element here that's irrational. That's what the Baal Shem Tov was all about. But it also, I'll get to you in a second, it also explains why Chassidus is still alive. Why Chassidus refuses to die. It refuses to go away. It's a fringe, it's a bunch of radicals, they're wackos with funny hats. The funny hat is not Chassidus. The funny hat is a funny hat. The side locks is not Chassidus, it's side locks. The unhealthy Eastern European food with all the fat is not Chassidus. It's unhealthy Eastern European food with a lot of fat, a lot of cholesterol. Chassidus is neshama. And you can run, but you can't hide. Ayid has a neshama. This is what the Baal Shem Tov taught. Go ahead, speak.
A middle-aged or older person who's asked by a young solicitor, "You're Jewish," and the man says no, and he says, "You're not a Jew." If he had been brought up for a while as a child as a Jew and gone away from it, it's going to make him start thinking, because he's had many years of experience, he's seen things happen, he may feel guilty or maybe he's missing something because he knows people who are Jewish and who have benefited and prospered by it, and that maybe this meeting has some significance. And by lying and saying, "No, I'm not a Jew," that day he gets away with it. But a day, a second or third time later, if he started over, he may realize it was an opportunity he threw away because maybe he threw something in life away that was very important. And it may cause him to say yes at a later time. So I think that's why he said that. You're not a Jew. He's making the guy have second thoughts.
Right.
He's lost it.
Imagine trying that on an ex-Christian.
Pardon?
On somebody who went away from Christianity or Islam or even an Eastern
It
religion.
should work with anyone who thought their religion was legitimate.
No comment. Your point is absolutely correct.
So that's faith.
That's right.
Some Jews have faith, and faith is difficult to grapple with. But it's there and it's real.
Can I ask you to say L'chaim? Or you're driving? No, I mean with Ingenhol. Please.
What you're saying is Judaism. What you're saying as if it was the invention of the Rebbe. When God revealed himself on Mount Sinai, it revealed himself to all of us. So we all identify ourselves with eternal God. Right. We all have God's soul. Right. Judaism believes in that. Right. So what is new? What that Rebbe says, maybe he emphasized on that. Maybe I don't understand what is new. That
I agree with every single word you just uttered.
But what is that you're saying that it is not what?
What am I saying? You have children?
Yes.
Okay. They're American?
What do you mean if they're American?
That's a complicated question. Did I just ask you if you're Jewish?
Because no, they were born in Iran.
Okay. Your children have children?
Yes.
Are they American?
You're Jewish first and then you're American.
Are they American?
No, they are Jewish.
Why don't you ask them?
They say they are Jewish.
Good.
I know.
I believe you. I'd like to believe you. It's not as easy for them as it is for you. You come from a Sephardi culture. You don't understand the West. Your grandchildren are Western. The West is very skeptical. You're absolutely right. If all Jews lived in Iran, there would not have been a Baal Shem Tov. But Jews didn't live in Iran. They lived in Germany. They lived in France.
But it is in the Torah that God revealed.
Of course it's in the Torah, but you know what else there is? There is something called a Yetzer Hara. You ever heard of him?
Yeah.
The Yetzer Hara takes on many forms. One of the forms of the Yetzer Hara is that when you say, God came to Mount Sinai and He revealed Himself to all of us, and we all believe it, all the Yetzer Hara says, do you really believe God came down on the mountain and gave you two stone tablets?
They are here. Jews believe it. They all believe it. They don't say it, otherwise we are not going to be here.
Esther, if you were right and Rabbi Yossi was wrong, it would be, if your mindset was the prevailing mindset, you wouldn't know a Jew that didn't keep Shabbos or kosher. And the reality is, you know too many of them that don't. Why is that? If your mindset is the correct mindset as not correct in theory, correct in practice, and that is the way every Jew in this society saw Yiddishkeit, as Rabbi Yossi says, we wouldn't need the Baal Shem Tov. The unfortunate reality is that most Jews that you know, including most Jews in your own very family, don't keep to those ideals. Let's recognize that. In theory, in speech maybe, but in practice and in life.
Or between the Mitnagdim and the Chassidus end. That now you can be in a regular synagogue and they'll be quoting a Hasidic rabbi or something. Like, when did this battle end? Because Rabbi, you sent out a very interesting, Rabbi Mendy, you sent out a very interesting thing in your email about it was other Jews that reported the Yalatu Rebbe. and to the Tsar. I was reading this whole thing. It made me sick. It made me sick. When did this war end? Or this is not end. I mean, there's certain areas it's not end, but like between, say, Torah Lakes is a non-Hasidic Orthodox, and we're Hasidic here. When did it end?
I can give you a politically correct answer, and I can give you a politically incorrect answer.
I like incorrect. I don't like political correctness. I hate it. I want the truth.
I'm not sure what the truth is, but there are two answers to the question. One answer to the question is because Hasidim turned out to be Jews, like everybody else.
Jewish, like you say, Jewish. Like
Yeah. In other words, the Misnagdim didn't trust us. They were afraid that we were some kind of a cult. And over the course of time, they discovered, well, we're a little crazy, we have funny hats, but we're pretty much the same. No, we dance, and we have rabbis and wagon drivers sitting at the same table studying Torah rather than have this elitism and these divisions. But we're pretty much the same. That's the politically correct answer. The politically incorrect answer is anti-Semitism. And we unfortunately acquired common enemies. And we realized that the things that separate, the expression, what divide us is much, much less than what unite us. There is certainly that factor. The 19th century was very cruel to Jews in Russia. Unbelievably cruel. And the Hasidim and the Misnagdim lived in Russia. And at a certain point, they needed to collaborate to survive. Even before the Alter Rebbe passed away, the earliest indications of peace are already documented. It was a very, very bitter division. It really was. And a lot of people were believers. They really believed Hasidim were bad people, you understand? But, like I said to you, if you want to be politically correct, the answer is Hasidim proved that they're pretty much the same like everybody else. They emphasize the heart rather than the mind, the soul rather than the mind, but they practice the same Torah and the same mitzvahs. There's no monkey business. But there is certainly an element of, unfortunately, oftentimes what brings Jews together is suffering. And it happens. Politics you have to be able to afford. One of the signs of success is politics. It's true. In a family, in a community, if you can fight, that means there's enough of you and there's enough resources that you can afford to kill each other, which is so stupid. But it's just the way the world works.